Alright guys, Bill here back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Big Brother Top 10 player ranking based on a specific time in Big Brother history, this probably being the final one of those, and that being the top 10 players immediately after Big Brother 16. Now again, I've done this in the past for right before All-Stars and right after BB10, and I feel like BB16 is kind of the last point where there are again, somewhat significant changes to the list to make this video here, and even here, to be honest, the changes to the list aren't that significant to where I did very much consider even making this video, though again I did feel like this was like the final step before where my list was at the time of the first time I ever did it. Well, again, there are going to be players that are added in between that time from the likes of Vanessa and Paul and Tyler. I feel like BB16 was kind of this decent enough middle ground before it fully forms into what my list was at the time, but also enough different from what it was at the time BB10, where I felt like doing the video based around this specific time. But with that, again, let's talk through the list. Again, this will be my ranking of these players based on how I feel like they play on any given season. Let's start off with the honorable mentions. Now, first I'm going to talk about the people that were on the list last time, at the time of BB10, but not at the time of BB16, which is essentially just knocking off the bottom three to where there are three additions to the list. The first of which being Nicole from BB2, who again, I think is a good player for the time of BB2. I think she plays the game in a very dynamic way. That is, again, surprising to see in BB2. However, by this point, it just simply isn't good enough to be in the top 10. She was someone that was hated by the jury, and even then, again, definitely had some wonky other aspects to her game. Where while I think she's a pretty competent player strategically and decent enough at challenges and can build strong bonds, I don't feel like it's enough to be in the top 10 at this current point. Next person that didn't make the cut anymore is Mike Boogie, who again was number 9 on the last list. At this point, I do think we kind of have a full grasp of Boogie as a player, which again, this would be the point where we're immediately after BB14, so he has played one more time in this time period, and really BB14 doesn't really change much for me. Again, I think Boogie is a player that is highly variant. I think he's one that can come into the game, play a very impressive game, make some big moves, but he's also one that can kind of have things blow up in his face, and I think he's kind of aloof to certain aspects of the game, particularly due to his ego, which I think he kind of neglects and underestimates other members of the cast, where again, I think Boogie, by the time of BB14 and seeing him again not realizing that Ian had flipped and in general being outplayed by the likes of Dan and Brittany, I think really just shows again that he has that fault in his game. Yet I do think Boogie is still a good player. Again, I think Boogie is a underrated player potentially in the modern day, with so many people saying that it was just Will that got him the win, where again I think he does a lot of good work in All-Stars. Even at the time of BB2, I think he had some innovative thoughts about the game at that current point. For someone that was, again, the first ever HOH, I think he plays that first HOH in a really interesting way, even though, again, it blows up in his face. But again, I think Boogie's a better player than most people would give him credit for, even though, again, not saying much about him as a person outside the show. But again, as a player in the game, I do think he is, again, still a competent player. But again, at the end of the day, at this point, it's not enough to be in the top 10. I just think, again, he's too highly variant. So again, it would have knocked him off. And the other person that would not make the top 10 anymore is Maggie from BB6. And again, Maggie is just a player to me that is really not that far away from someone like Nicole, but just a Nicole that won the game. Someone that had a very strong strategic mind for the game. Again, was able to corral this group together and have her allies really take the bullets for her while she's able to get to the end. Sort of despite there being a split house dynamic, she was relatively safe for a lot of the season. Again, that is very impressive. The issues come from the fact that she was just hated by half the house, and just socially her game was largely lackluster in that front. I think she really struggles in winning a jury vote against any other friendship member on this season. Really, I think Yvette is probably the only person that she does beat. And I think she struggles to get more than 4 votes in any jury situation, which is not good. Mixing out the fact that, again, she's not particularly good at competitions, which, again, at the end of the day isn't the end all be all, but I do think is something to definitely factor in here. The fact that I think in a precarious spot, she's not particularly likely to win her way out of that. While, again, we saw her do some good social work to get her out of a sticky situation and convincing Howie to go after James, I feel like at the end of the day, I would not have much faith in Maggie on a return. I don't feel like Maggie's the type of player that would consistently do well in the game, even though her one game is very impressive, to where, again, I just don't think it's enough to be in the top 10. But again, those are the players that were on the list last time, but are not on now. Now let's talk about the players that have played in between BB's 11 and 16, and talk about who is at least somewhat in contention to make the list. First up, we got Jesse Goddards, who obviously ended up playing again after BB10 and BB11, and obviously his BB11 game is much better. I think he obviously demonstrates being able to really run the house for the first half of the game, though at the same time, again, there's still some wonkiness in that. He's still not able to rein Russell in and loses Ronnie because of that, he still is in a spot where half the house is pretty much targeting him by the time he goes home, where while people talk about how he was screwed by the coup d'etat, and his game is already on the downhill slope by that point anyway, where while I do think he definitely goes up on the list over this period of time, it's not enough to be in the top 10. Also, I'd consider Big Jeff, who, again, at this point has played 2 times, to where, again, as much as, again, not a big Jeff person, I do feel like Jeff plays a solid game both of his times. Again, while, yes, he was very helped out by production, BB11 in particular, he still comes extremely close to winning the game. And in a spot where, again, I think he does some good social work across that season in pulling over Russell, and then also, again, getting Jesse to actually want to keep him around over the likes of Russell and Kevin and Michelle, where, again, I think he's an understated player in BB11. BB13, again, he's much more of a domineering figure in that season. He definitely does come off as on a bit of a high horse, but again, he still does play a somewhat decent game and does end up being targeted by half the house by the time he goes home, which is not great, but still, even then, not even the entire house was after him at that point. He was essentially in a spot where he had to be kind of sniped out of the game. So obviously there's the fault of him not maintaining Shelly, but again, I still think he actually plays a decent BB13 game as well. Like, I think he is actually a somewhat consistent player, but again, for this list, not enough to be in the top 10. Next up, we got Kevin Campbell, and Kevin Campbell is a player that at the time, I looked at Kevin Campbell very highly. I think Kevin Campbell's BB11 game, again, is very, very good. I looked at him as one of the better final jurors at that point. However, I do think over time, my opinion of his BB11 game goes down, where obviously I think the general perception of Kevin Campbell is lower nowadays because of BB22. However, that's not the reason why I'm lower on him personally. If anything, I think that actually keeps him higher on my personal list and showing like a level of consistency there, making it somewhat deep. But I do think Kevin's BB11 game, again, is just kind of sloppy, where it's just kind of in and out of the majority throughout most of the game. And while I do think he has a pretty good end game stretch, I do think the middle portion of his game is pretty bad, and him losing trust with Jesse and Jesse actually wanting him out by the time the coup d'etat happens, and him actually probably being one of the people that's the most benefited by the coup d'etat. To where while I do think obviously there's very impressive play there, again, I still do look at him as a bit of a sloppy player to where he did not make it on. Also considered Natalie as the runner-up of that season, but again, I never particularly looked at Natalie too highly, and at the end of the day, I mean, in comparison to all the people we talked about so far, I do look at them as better players than Natalie, but again, she gets to the end, plays a very scrappy game, but one that just, again, is too messy to make the top 10. Also going to consider Jordan, where by this point, she actually does have one of the better averages in the history of Big Brother, in having a win, followed by a 4th place finish. Before Dan's later appearance in BB14, again, she was tied with Will for having the highest average placement. Again, that is impressive, even though, again, how much of that is due to active work Jordan does. Now, again, Jordan does seem to be a very consistent player, someone that will consistently make it deep into the game, but how likely is she going to make it to the end? Again, I don't feel like she particularly is. I mean, even BB14, where, yeah, she makes it to 4th, but she really shouldn't have made it that far. She was someone that was pretty much dead man walking at 6 had it not been for Pandora's box, and even in her win, again, she was kind of just like straggling on the bottom for a lot of that game. And in general, again, I think Jordan, again, obviously has some level of consistency there. Yeah, I just don't feel like Jordan has enough active play for her to be in the top 10. Now we go on to BB12, and here you have Rachel Riley, again, at this point, a winner of the show, 2-time player, though, again, Rachel Riley's not that good of a player in the grand scheme of things. I mean, her first run is really bad, pretty much exactly what to not do in Big Brother, while her second run is one that's plagued with her being benefited by both the format and also just additional twists being added along the way, to where I do think neither of her games are particularly impressive, to where while, again, yeah, she has played twice and has won the game, I don't feel like it's anywhere close to being enough to be in the top 10 at this point. Also, I would consider Matt Hoffman, who, again, is a player that essentially credited the creation of the brigade, where while Enzo will take credit for putting the group together, Matt is essentially one to detail the strategy that they utilized in the game. And through that, again, I think that deserves a lot of credit, though at the end of the day, again, also had a lot of sloppy play towards the end of his run that makes him someone that is not particularly close to making the top 10. Also, we got Brittany Haynes, who at this point is a 2-time player and has, again, a pretty decent track record. I mean, she makes it to 4th on BB12. Now, despite her placement, her game is not overly impressive. Again, she's largely being snowed by the brigade that entire season, but again, she's the last person standing of the non-brigade members. So again, at least that means something for her navigation of the game. And the second time around, I think she plays a much more impressive game. While there's definitely spots where she's on the bottom, I do think she really recovers from that very well. And by the time she was booted, she had a pretty decent backing that took a really massive move from Dan to get her sniped out of the game, with her also being kind of unlucky in the fact that Ian had immunity. That led to Frank wanting her out over Ian, to where had Frank wanting her out. To where, again, I think Brittany's track record as a whole is pretty impressive, to where she actually would have been somewhat close to making the list, though again, still does not crack the top 10. Next up, we gotta talk about Enzo, who, again, is credited the creation of the brigade. That's something. Realistically, at this point, I would not actually look at Enzo that highly, where while Enzo is, again, nearing my top 10 in my current day list after BB22, I think after BB12, my opinion of him was not particularly high due to the fact that he had almost no win equity if he had gotten to the end. And even despite that, I think Enzo was not really that active a participant in the brigade. I think he was probably the least integral to the brigade's success, where while he does get the group together, that's really pretty much all he does. Where outside that, I feel like the likes of Hayden and Matt are doing a lot more active work throughout the season. I feel like even Lane is doing a lot to manage his relationship with Brittany, to where, again, Enzo is just kind of there. I mean, kind of doing what Hayden is doing as well, but not really doing anything on his own, to where, and he would not crack the top 10. Also, Lane is someone to mention here who, again, I think is actually a pretty competent player. Again, a very underrated player in the fact that I think he was probably the most self-interested of the brigade, to where he was most willing to work outside of the brigade and was doing good work and managing Brittany to take him to the end and got her towards the end. And also him being a pretty competent all-around player, again, being at least liked socially, again, not necessarily respected, but again, liked, being the type of guy that can win challenges, even though, again, doesn't really demonstrate that for a lot of the season, and being a person that, again, strategically is at least competent, to where, again, he's at least a consideration here, yet he would not have cracked the top 10. Next for BB13, I mean, I'm going to mention Danny Donato, who at this point would be a two-time player, to where while her BB8 run is not particularly impressive, I do think her BB13 run, again, shows, again, at least a level of consistency. She makes it somewhat deep into the game twice, and did have a very solid grouping of allies. The problem is that grouping was in the minority, and really, she ends up playing herself into the bottom as well, in a spot where she essentially need to win comps back-to-back with Kalia, to where, again, at the end of the day, I do think while there is some good to be taken from her BB13 run, it's not quite enough to make it onto the final list. Someone more so in consideration was Shelly from BB13, and again, Shelly is someone that plays a very impressive game on BB13, and she kind of plays the perfect game for playing a mixed season, again, working with the vets initially, cultivating really strong bonds with them, to then recognize at the end that she has the flip on them and makes the move against Jeff. Now, again, I think her timing of it is not ideal. And also, again, she kind of leaks her plan to where Jeff hears about it before it happens, so where, again, all that is pretty sloppy, but I do think she comes in the season with the right idea, and I do think she was very important to how the season played out. Again, she does very good work in maintaining the loyalty of both sides and is able to guide the game in the way that she wants it. Yeah, I do think at the end of the day, she plays pretty sloppily at the end, where, while I think she gets screwed over by Pandora's Box, I think she was kind of in a non-winning position by that point in the game anyway, to where, again, she would definitely be in consideration. Yeah, I think she would still not quite make the top 10, except for BB14. Again, I would consider Shane, who is someone that feels like an all-around player here, someone that is, again, very good at challenges, obviously, someone that is very affable socially, and someone that strategically is fine and a bit too loyal, which obviously leads to him being blindsided the way that he does. But again, I think Shane is a player that is kind of just a basic all-around competent player, but he doesn't make the list. Next up, I would consider Danielle. Now, again, she's not really that close to making the list, but again, when I'm mentioning someone like Natalie, I feel like Danielle is like not that far away from that, to where, again, Danielle is a player that, again, was working alongside Dan for the entire season. While she was considered like a lackey of his, I do feel like she does good work on her own. I mean, while she definitely had some pretty insane moments in the house, I do feel like she's still a player that is just kind of competent all around, or while she's being outplayed strategically by Dan, she still had a decent mind of her own. She was somewhat good socially, and she had really good bonds towards the end game, and, was good at challenges as well, where, again, I think she's a pretty competent all-around player, but again, not enough to be in the top 10. Also, obviously, got to talk about the winner of the season, and Ian, though Ian is not particularly close to making it on the list. Again, I think at this point, I would not look at Ian particularly highly. Now, maybe by this actual point, again, if I'm actually looking at myself after BB16, maybe I would be thinking there would be more potential for him, considering he had been a common podcast guest on RHAP, and he comes off very intellectual there. But I think at the end of the day, he comes off as a player that is simply just better at analyzing the game than he is actually playing the game. And I do think Ian is someone that, sadly, I think struggles with actually playing the game the majority of the time, with his winning season being one where he's, again, just kind of out of the loop the entire time and just winning comps to get to the end, a spot where he would have been taken out before that if he didn't win many of those comps, to where I don't think Ian's game is particularly impressive, but I guess there's a chance I would look them higher at this current point in Big Brother. Next for BB15, again, we're going to consider Amanda. So I remember at this point, I was considering Amanda a very strong player. I mean, she's someone that really dominated a lot of BB15. And while things really went off the rails towards the end, pretty much after the Herren boot, I feel like she still did demonstrate a lot of good play there. The issue is, again, win equity. I don't know how likely she is to win the game when she gets to the end. I think there's a decent amount of anti-Amanda sentiment, to where I think that would definitely harm her there. But also, again, she was still not particularly close to actually getting to the end. I mean, she was still a decent ways away from that. So again, Amanda wasn't that close to making it on. But also, I did consider Spencer, who, again, I think plays the game in a very interesting way, playing from this position of him trying to utilize the pawn position to navigate through the game, and him thinking that if he's on the block as a pawn and is this perpetual pawn, it will allow him to, one, gain social capital of the people that he allows to use him as a pawn, but also it would kind of just make everyone else just kind of look at it as it being hopeless. against him as a pawn, as everyone against him just goes home, to where I do think Spencer uses the pawn position in a really interesting way. Again, not really enough to be in the top 10. And last up for BB16, I am going to consider Frankie, where, again, Frankie is a player that just feels like an all-arounder. I mean, very good at challenges, pretty decent socially until he gets to the point where he's bragging about his sister, and competent strategically, even though he planned on cutting Zach very early on, which was really dumb. But again, like, I feel like he does come off as a very competent all-around player on BB16, comes extremely close to winning the game, though at the same time, just did not manage his relationships well enough, did not manage his threat level well enough. So again, at the end of the day, he was not that close to making the top 10. And also, we got to consider Cody, to where, while at this point, again, before BB22, there was a lot of sentiment that Cody's the dumbest player ever, he took Derrick to the end, what an idiot. However, I do think Cody still is actually a really great player at this current point. I mean, obviously he, yes, takes Derrick to the end, and that is bad, but that doesn't nullify the rest of his game to me. But again, the rest of his game is still very impressive. He runs the game alongside Derrick. He comes off as a very competent all-around player. I mean, he is very good at challenges. He is so, like, socially in the house, and he definitely had a very competent strategic mind. Make these decisions alongside Derrick, to where, again, I think Cody is probably an underestimated player at this current point in Big Brother, though, and again, I just feel like the fact that he doesn't win, along with the fact that he does show that lack of killer instinct, again, it's not enough to be in the top 10. But there we go, and that's all the honorable mentions. Now let's get into the actual top 10, which straight up, I mean, the beginning of this list is pretty much exactly the same, to where numbers 10 through 6 are pretty much the same as the last list, just jumping people down. Really, the big changes come from the very top, where 4 of the top 5 are people that have played again in this time period. But again, let's run through the people at the bottom relatively quickly here. Again, first up at number 10, we do have Jason Guy. Again, just jumping a bit down on the list just because more people are added above him. Straight up, I do think Jason's kind of in a precarious spot at this point. I'll be honest, like, I would consider dropping him off for the likes of Cody, to where, again, I think they're similar caliber players at this current point. Obviously, the difference is that Jason Guy had more win equity than Cody did. I do think Cody had more natural instincts for the game, to where, again, I think this is actually kind of a close one. Yeah, again, I still would have gone for Jason instead. I think Jason, again, is just a very good all-around player. I think he obviously does have some missteps in his game. Yeah, overall, still a solid player. And for being a one-time non-winning player, I think it's impressive that he still would be in the top 10 at this point. With that, we move on to number 9. We're at number 9, again, same thing. We have Eric Stein, who ends up being the top one-time non-winning player on this list. So again, Eric Stein is a player that demonstrated a lot of skills on BB8. I mean, he seemed to be in a position to really run that show and simply just doesn't because America told him not to, where he gets very much screwed over by the America's player twist. But despite that, I think he plays a very competent game on that season, where had he not been thrown under a bus by America, essentially, he would have been able to really take the reins of the game and get his alliance of him, Jessica, Dustin, Jamaica, and Amber towards the end game. And while I do think he still probably needed to make a move within that at some point, again, I still think he had the ability to definitely do so. And I do think Eric, again, comes off as a very, very strong player. In my opinion of him, doesn't really change over this period of time. Next, for number 8, we're moving on to, again, same person. We got Drew Daniel from BB5. And again, Drew, solid all-around player, a player that has demonstrated good skills in most aspects of the game, very good at challenges, mental ones in particular, which, again, considering he's also this athletic guy, also probably means he would win more physical challenges as well. He also is very good socially. Again, the entire house adored him, and he's in a spot where, again, I think he wins in most given scenarios on that season. While strategically, again, he's a bit more rocky. I think he does have some good thoughts at points, though also has some poor reads at points. Again, I think he is definitely a question mark there, and that's a lot of the reason why he's not higher on this list, because, again, on paper, he is a perfect Big Brother player. He is a type of person that will do well on most given seasons. But I think his lack in the strategic aspects of the game or something that really harm him on this list. That mixed into the fact that he was never in a like really solid majority is what leaves Drew here number 8. At number 7, moving on to it again. Same placement, we got June Song. And again, I think June is one of the better strategic players in history of the show. I think she has a very good strategic mind for the game. I think she has a very innovative strategic mind for that point in Big Brother, where I think she had a lot of awareness of what was going on in the house and was able to really play the middle really well. Now, again, I've always had issues with the fact that she barely wins a jury vote. So again, I've always had issues with the fact that I think she only beats Allison, and even in other situations where she does, it's very close. Yeah, I do think as a whole, I do think June is someone that I do look at very highly for being to really utilize this like floater strategy really well. Where while I do think, again, her game on that season is not as consistent as I would like it to be, I do feel like in the grand scheme of things, I would have a decent amount of faith in her. Though again, nothing would really change since the time of the last list. Now at number 6, we're moving on to, again, the top non-winning player on this list, and that person is Danielle Reyes. And again, Danny Reyes is someone that obviously plays a very impressive game on BB3, a very innovative game for the time, is really able to run the show pretty much from beginning to end, where her and Jason are able to build really strong connections at the very beginning of the game and really take the reins by the time the Derrick vote, to where her game from that point on, again, is very impressive, even though, again, she is making some strategic fallacies, particularly in taking Lisa to the end over Amy, and in general, her wanting to go to the end of Jason as well was also really bad. But again, I think she definitely demonstrates a lot of skill for the game on BB3. While on All-Stars, it's not as consistent of a run. She's definitely being outplayed by Chilltown at points. She's definitely on the bottom at points. She definitely has some sloppy play at points, yet she still is able to navigate all the way to the final 6 with a massive target on her back, to where, again, I think that's something that really adds to her legacy to me, even though her game is not as strong there, to where I think that's the main reason she's above June. I think without that, I would contemplate having June above her. Yeah, I think with the added season of her making it somewhat deep, again, it's enough to put Danielle here at number 6. Now number 5, and now we're finally getting to the changes on this list, where again, 4 of these top 5 are either new or have additional context to be added here. And let's start off at number 5, a player that, to be honest, at the time, I might have had this person higher. I mean, on my original list, I had this person higher, best players of all time. For my opinion, them has gone down over time, yet still very highly ranked here, and that person is Hayden Moss from BB12. And Hayden is a player that, again, plays a very impressive game. Again, he is in the Brigade Alliance. While he's not out in front at the very beginning, he's able to take the reins after blindsiding Matt, and from that point on is the massive front runner to win the game and goes on to win the game. So in many ways, again, I do think you compare him to Drew in terms of just how they are as players. Again, both very physical, can definitely win a lot of comps, both very social, very liked by their cast. But again, I think the difference comes strategically. I think Hayden has more of a killer instinct. Again, Hayden really led the charge in getting rid of Matt and then guaranteed himself final 2 by the time of the final 3, which technically Drew does as well, but I think with him, it's a lot more accidental than purposeful. And Drew, again, I think just kind of stumbles around the game a bit more, while Hayden's in a more dominant alliance the entire time, to where, again, I think Hayden, again, kind of comes off as the prototypical Big Brother player over the course of BB12. Again, playing extremely impressive game, facing almost no adversity and making some moves to where, again, overall, he comes off as a great player. And I think if this was specifically at the time, there's definitely a chance of him being higher. Yeah, basically on my current view of Hayden as a player, again, it puts him around here at number 5. Number 4, and at number 4, moving on to a player that most people would expect to be number 1 or number 2 on this list. However, at number 4, we have the only person in the top 5 to have not changed over this period of time. That person is Dr. Will. And again, Dr. Will is a player that I've always personally found to be overrated by the online community. I do feel like Dr. Will is just a very sloppy player. While, again, still very good, has definitely demonstrated some very good skills at the game, is also still a very sloppy player. Really, on both of his appearances, he has a lot of actively bad play. For a while, again, he does do very good work. And again, like getting Nicole to take him to the end, and getting Hardy and Nicole to not target him for a lot of BB2, and also does good work in BB7. Again, really orchestrates a lot of what's going on in the house there. Again, all that is still surrounded by some pretty sloppy play. Again, he plays terribly during the beginning of BB2 and makes himself the number 1 target for the majority of the house. He has very sloppy play at the final 4 of BB7, to where the women end up comparing notes and snipe him out of the game, to where I think he has sloppy play there. Now, again, none of this really changes from the time period of BB10 to BB16, though, again, I think actually practically, though, I think there is a change for me, where I think this is around the time that I would have been a bit lower on Will, finally. I think this is around the time that I would have rewatched BB2, to where I would realize, oh wait, Will actually isn't that great. Again, a lot of the assumption is that Will is one of the best players of all time, and a lot of people talk about how BB2 Will is one of the best winning games in History Show, which is just pure insanity to me. And I think this is around the time, in real time, that I actually realized that fact, to where I think this is around the point that I would have dropped Will on my ranking. And again, at the end of the day, he lands here number 4. Now, number 3, and again, these top 3 are all players that played in the time between 10 and 16. Really, all 3 of these players actually played in the last 3 seasons of the show at that current point. And we're starting off with the new hotness on the list here. We got Derrick Lavasseur, where, again, this is immediately after his win on BB16. And I think this is an appropriate ranking at this current point. I think this is about what I thought of him at the time, to where, again, Derrick is a player that I think played a very domineering game. Again, really ran the show the entire time, was able to utilize the bomb squad and detonators to navigate through the game unscathed, and had really strong relationships within that, to where almost everyone within that group wanted to take him to the final 2, to where he would have beat them, to where, again, it's a very impressive game. However, I do think there are things to detract from him. I mean, the fact that he had, like, Team America involved, that stopped Donnie and Frankie from talking about taking him out earlier in the season. You had things like Bow the Block, which obviously incentivized the majority alliance to really stick together due to how important numbers were for situations like that. And again, I think Derrick plays a very strong game, but I think there are these things to detract from him. Now, obviously, this is him being lower than what he is on my current list, despite the fact that he hasn't played again, where, again, he is higher than my number 2 person on this list in the modern day. And really that stems from the fact that, obviously, people are able to utilize Derrick's strategy again. Specifically, his own number one ally is able to come back on BB All-Stars and really just utilize the same strategy again and dominate the game once again, where I think it really ends up booning Derrick's game for me. Again, it kind of shows that Derrick's game is repeatable if he doesn't have this massive target on his back. As again, I think Derrick really utilizes this strategy of creating this like onion-based alliance and uses it to really great effect. Again, we later see the likes of Paul, the likes of Tyler, the likes of Cody utilize similar strategies to where, again, I do think the fact that this became the meta of Big Brother, of creating a big alliance with all the good comp competitors and then make yourself the best position within that and systematically take out the people outside. Again, that is a very good strategy that Derrick utilizes that, again, I think further gets proved over time. Yeah, I do think at the time BB16 it gets more unproven to where I think it's a game that I would have been a bit more rocky on whether or not it would be consistent on Big Brother, to where, again, because of that I would not move him higher than my number 2 pick, but he is here number 3. Now number 2, moving on to, again, a player that I've always looked at as one of the best of all time, even though at this point there was a lot of negativity towards that person, but at number 2 I do have Andy Herren. And straight up, I mean, if this was the list from at the time of BB10 and just adding Andy in, Andy would have been number 1. I think Andy is a player that I was so impressed with at the time BB15. Again, at the time BB15, it was pretty much the first season that throughout the entirety of it, I was looking at it from a more critical view, looking at more from a gameplay perspective, and I think Andy really just impressed me through that run. Again, the fact that he was able to really float between all sides and be very well ingratiated between all of them and being trusted by everybody, never targeted throughout the entire season, and having massive win equity by the end while also organizing the exterminators and pulling off this move against Amanda and then taking out Alyssa. And there's a lot very impressive about Andy's game. And again, I think he plays a strategy that at this point I would look at as extremely repeatable. I think he's a player that if he were given a new group of people that did not know him, I think he would be able to utilize his strategy over and over and over again and be very effective using that strategy. Sure, while again, I do think the game of Big Brother has become a lot more alliance-based and involves creating these like big majority groups that really run the show, I feel like at this current point that really wasn't the meta of Big Brother. And I think it was much more focused around these smaller groups. Again, with Andy's strategy of really bouncing around all these different groups, I think he would have been able to utilize this to a great degree at this current point. But I think actually the current meta of Big Brother is something that harms someone like Andy as a player a bit more. But again, this is at the time of BB16, to where I don't think that would have been the norm. And I do think Andy, again, comes off as a very competent player, one that plays a pretty perfect winning game while also seeming to have the skills that would be necessary for him to win on any given season, with very good strategic ability, knowing the right timing of when to do each of his moves, again, being very good socially where everyone loved him, and again, still being competent at comps, where, again, I think Andy is an all-around really great player here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player at the time of BB16 is Dan Giesling still. Now, since the BB10 video, obviously Dan would have played again at BB14, and well, obviously it would have been even better if he did win BB14. I mean, I think the fact that he still got to the end, faced so much adversity that entire time, had an entire jury that did not want to reward him with the win because he already had a win. I think the fact that he was able to get to the final 2 there is still extremely impressive. So again, he was already number 1 after BB10, and again, at this point, I still would have looked at it as a very impressive win, though again, his appearance on BB14 really showed him taking his BB10 game to another extreme. Again, playing a game where he was constantly facing adversity and had to overcome it. And obviously having this big legacy coming in as a former winner, and through that having this bullseye on his back initially, while also having the things that Ian were doing, blowing back on him, with Boogie thinking it was Dan that was ratting him out. Obviously him having to do Dan's funeral, which in itself is a very impressive move there. And even in the end game where he wanted to take out both Shane and Ian, they just constantly won comps over and over and over again, to where he simply didn't have the opportunities to take them out and had to take out Shane in a very explosive way at Final 4, and then essentially was in a non-winning position for the majority of the end game, just simply due to how those comps played out, to where I think he would have had at least a shot against the likes of Jen and Joe, but was simply not able to get them further into the game because of those comp wins. So again, I think BB14 really demonstrates some very impressive navigation through the game, even though again the win equity was not there. But I don't really fault him for having no win equity, considering the cast's agreement to not give him the win from the very beginning anyway. To where again, I think it's BB14 that really solidifies his legacy here. Again, if BB14 did not happen, I would probably have Andy above him at this current point. However, I do think, again, having 2 really deep runs, both very impressive runs in their own different ways, is what really excels Dan here to be the number 1, which is where he currently still stands. But there we go. I mean, with that is my top 10 players after BB16. Again, I don't think there's a point in doing another one of these. I think BB16 is kind of the final point where there are these significant changes between this and my next list. So again, the actual first time I did my BB player ranking was before BB22, where again, at that point I would add Vanessa to the list, who would probably be between Danielle and June on this list. I would also add in the likes of Paul and Tyler, who both would probably be right above Danielle on this list. So where at that point, again, that was a pretty solidified top 9 for me. So it was just a question of who's number 10, which is again is essentially where we're at with the current list. So where again, while nowadays I would consider the likes of Nicole typical Franzel. Even at that current point, again, I don't think it's enough to make its own video. So again, this is the end of this specific series. Obviously, still, I'll be continuing to do Big Brother Survivor videos down the road. Expect the same style of content. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.